Hey everybody, Joe Moore here, Psychedelics Today. Thanks for tuning in again. Today on the show, Kyle Buller and I talked to Daniel Greig from Toronto. He's a student at the University of Toronto doing some really interesting education projects right now. And he is a very smart dude. So we had a fun time talking to him, went all over the map, and can't wait to interview with him again. So I guess we won't go too deep here into what we chat about, but I hope you enjoy it. So if you want to support the show, everybody, we need your support. Please go over to patreon.com/psychedelics today. Check out our new offers. You might like some of them quite a bit. We've got a shop, psychedelicstodayshop.com, selling t-shirts, mugs, stickers, and more. Check it out. We'd love to just see more people wearing our logo here and there. So if you have any questions about that, shoot us an email, psychedelicstoday@gmail.com. And we'd just really also love some social media shares. Just, tag us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, follow us there, and maybe check us out on YouTube. All our stuff's now getting posted on YouTube, which is really great. We also still have the Navigating Psychedelics class for sale, where you can learn the basics of harm reduction, psychedelic science theory, and, just pretty much how to keep yourself out of jail, hospital, same with your friends, and, perhaps how to get a little bit of benefit from using psychedelics. So check that out, Navigating Psychedelics. You find it at psychedelicstoday.com. So thank you all for listening. Hope you enjoy this interview with Daniel Greig, and see you on the other side.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics Today with your host, Kyle Buller and Joe Moore. Today we are here with Dan Greig from University of Toronto, correct? Just based on where you're from. And then you're also a community organizer for various psychedelic organizations. So you are working with SSDP over in Canada, and also you've been affiliated with the Toronto Psychedelic Society, and you put on a pretty cool event recently, or a few months ago, that was also kind of sponsored by MAPS, which was really cool. So yeah, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I am glad to be here.
Yeah. Maybe do you want to just give a little bit more of a background of what I missed?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm a student of cognitive science and philosophy at the University of Toronto. I'm just finishing up my undergrad now and working on some projects for publication. I do a lot of stuff related to the psychedelic research. My main area of interest is in mystical experiences, specifically delineating the difference between the unitive mystical experience of like oneness and transcendence and the visionary mystical experience, where you have like clear images and messages being presented to you within the context of an altered state of consciousness, whether that be initiated by psychedelics or otherwise. I, like you said, do work for CSSDP and at the University of Toronto chapter, as well as some affiliated work with the Toronto Psychedelic Society. That event that you mentioned was a class that I was running. It was a 4-part series on psychedelics called the Psychedelic State. We should be putting up the videos pretty soon for those. We broke it up into just the general overview of the research, a week on mystical experiences, a week on microdosing, and a week on wisdom and how the scientific research for wisdom relates to how we think about psychedelics and how we might be using them in therapeutic contexts. Oh, also, I should let this be known as well. In Toronto, we are hosting a conference coming up September 22nd called Mapping the Mind with Mushrooms. It's something that we do every year, and we're just in kind of the preliminary phases of getting everything organized, but we usually have a number of international speakers, and we try to make it affordable as well for members of the general community and students as well to sort of catch up on the research that's been going on in the psychedelic renaissance. So something to look out for if you are in the Toronto area.
Awesome. Thanks. And for those who don't know, 9/20, September 20 is, what is it, National or International Mushroom Day is the new
pretty much
holiday. Yeah. Sweet. Yeah. So how did you get involved in researching psychedelics at the, in the university, and what has that been like being an undergrad student with this interest in psychedelics? We definitely have a lot of students that listen and people always interested in getting involved. And so, yeah, what has that been like? I know it's probably kind of difficult coming out of the psychedelic closet in academia, but maybe that's not true for you in Canada. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, my experience has been fantastic. I've really never had to hide or be discreet about my research interests. And I think that at the University of Toronto, we're a little bit uniquely placed in that there's a lot of professors and researchers who are pretty interested in the subject. One professor that I've been working with, his name is DeBakey. He is very much on board with psychedelic research. And in my first year, I started going to school in 2014 here. I was in one of the classes for the Introduction to Cognitive Science. And I specifically remember one class who was talking about like transcranial direct stimulation and altered states of consciousness, and mentioned specifically that there are very good reasons we need to be studying LSD. And it was then that I knew that I had found my intellectual home. There's really not been any barriers for me, really, in talking about this. Starting in second year, I started organizing this Mapping the Mind with Mushrooms conference, and it's very easy to sell psychedelics to people. It's an area where many, many people are interested. It grew from an event of 50 people in the initial year to like 300 people last year. And wow. Yeah, it's amazing to be a student in this because people are actually interested in your work, right? Which you don't really find if you're doing run-of-the-mill like sociological work or anthropological work. There really is like a unique place that you can situate yourself within psychedelic research, in that people really want to hear what you have to say. And, it's becoming more and more out in the open, especially with the publication of Michael Pollan's new book. If you look at the media coverage, it's all predominantly, overwhelmingly positive. So, I have heard people from other schools saying that hasn't been precisely their experience, but here in Toronto, we seem to be pretty on board with the psychedelic research.
Yeah, and Canada just legalized marijuana nationally, so that's definitely a huge bonus too, I guess.
Yes. I'm hoping that becomes a gateway drug for other kinds of legalization.
Yeah, and it's interesting too. I think over in Vancouver, Ibogaine legal, so. Yeah, I know Toronto's a little bit different, but yeah, it's just interesting. It seems like Canada is a little bit more laid back in some aspects.
Yeah, for sure. There are some places where you can do Ibogaine therapy and it's completely above board, which is very interesting. I'm not 100% sure what the status of that is in Toronto. Ibogaine is not something I look at too much, but there are in Canada several places where you can get that kind of therapy. So yeah, an interesting loophole that we seem to have found.
Yep, saving lives. It's helpful. So
yeah,
that's cool.
And very much needed.
Yeah, right. I think in the States, 100 people a day die from opiate overdoses. And it often hits close to home for a lot of us. So hopefully we can figure that out sooner or later. I know it's not the magic bullet, but it's one of them.
Right, yes. We shouldn't be putting all our eggs in that basket, but at least several of them.
Absolutely. Okay,
yeah,
so go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I was going to also mention, because you sort of asked how I got interested in and started doing psychedelic-related work as well. And on the note of like mental health treatment and so on, that very much is a part of my own journey and my own experience. I started experimenting with psychedelics when I was about 18, just purely out of an interest in exploring every altered state of consciousness there was. I was reading a lot of science fiction, Philip K. Dick, Frank Herbert, and psychedelic drugs especially play a very large role in the plots of those stories. And I was actually more interested in being a science fiction author at the time, and I decided that I would just become a psychonaut and explore those various states of consciousness. And accidentally, I stumbled into a series of mystical experiences, which opened up for me a lot of areas of emotional processing that really weren't available to me at the time. I have been struggling with complex post-traumatic stress disorder and the depression and dissociation that comes along with that. And so it was those experiences that really oriented me towards researching this, because I was able to feel positive emotions again after not having been able to do that for many, many years, and I wanted to be able to bring those kinds of experiences to other people as well.
Yeah, that's huge. That is huge. I think both Kyle and I have worked with people with really extreme backgrounds, and both in breath work and now that we did our recent mushroom thing in Jamaica, like I think we have experience both, legally and otherwise, with that kind of stuff. So it's very interesting to see it firsthand. It's also very interesting to see what the data looks like on that stuff. Are there any recent studies in particular that got you really excited about these opportunities for healing and growth using psychedelics?
Yeah, definitely. There was a publication, 2017. I always forget the guy's last name, but it's looking at the role of mental imagery under the influence of LSD. And so I mentioned that one of the things I'm really interested in is like differentiating between the visionary and the unit of experience, especially sort of outlining what is the imagination, what are the functions of the imagination, and how does it play in cognition and in thinking. And so they showed that the mental imagery experiences that you have within the context of LSD are very much like the kinds of experiences that you get when you're dreaming. There's been other evidence shown by like Robin Carhart Harris's lab that the neural states of the psychedelic state are very similar to those that you see within the context of REM dreaming. And so they also showed that the phenomenology of the actual imagery itself does mimic what dreams are doing. The measure that they use is called cognitive bizarreness, and they pair that with the necessity of some sort of narrative quality to the imagery. So bizarreness is basically just a measure of how improbable or implausible the things that you're experiencing in the image are. And the way that they were testing this is that they would just give people very basic prompts, such as imagine yourself in a field, imagine yourself like looking just at a tree or something. And they would give them just mild affirming prompts, such as, yes, what do you see now? Okay, that's interesting. And what do you see next? And all of the people in this experiment are, healthy volunteers, clinically healthy. They don't have any history of mental illness or anything like that. They were just looking purely at the mental imagery and the effects of LSD on mental imagery. But there's this one quote in there, which is fascinating. And there's talking about this one person who finds himself sort of at the shoreline of some ocean or a lake or something. And as they're prompting him along, he finds himself on a pirate ship. He goes down into the bottom of the pirate ship and he sees, he's like, yeah, so I see like a dead pirate, an empty treasure chest, and like an empty bottle. And oh my God, I've been wasting my life away, spending too much time on my work. And I've been neglecting my relationships. And I really need to fix that. Otherwise, I'm not going to be happy. And I think that's just like a beautiful, beautiful example of how healing experiences are actually coming to people on psychedelics. It's actually the content. Engaging with the content itself is really, really necessary. We can't just sort of explain it away for the more generalized, abstract cognitive processes, because that's usually sort of the view that's taken. It's, well, what are the neural processing parameters at play in the psychedelic state? And the content kind of often is sort of pushed to the side for these other more general explanations. But I think that we're really going to need to flesh out how to engage with the content in order to actually first identify how psychedelics are being effective and to make them more effective, secondly.
So I hope this is the guy's name, Kranemann. Does that sound right?
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, so Swiss and German researchers. It looks like a whole bunch of people, 25 subjects. Pretty awesome. We'll link to that in the show notes.
Excellent. Yeah, and so related to this, there's another study. I think the guy's last name is pronounced Bogenschutz. He's a researcher at the New York University. They're currently running the alcohol use disorder treatments using psilocybin. And in a previous study in 2015, they had noted, like many other studies, that classical mystical content, being like transcendence of space and time, experiencing paradoxical truths simultaneously, feeling at one with yourself or with the world, those elements were predictive of people's positive response to therapy treatments, in that case for addiction. But in a study they just published in 2018, made note of the fact that it's not actually just the classical mystical content that seems to be predictive of people's healing experiences, but also elements of compassion, self-love, and forgiveness. And they outlined 3 people's treatments who have already gone through this study. The study is still underway. The paper is called something like The Phenomenology of People's Experiences under Psilocybin-Assisted Treatment for Alcohol Use Disorder. And I think that one of the reasons that doesn't seem to be mystical is simply just because of how we're defining mystical experiences right now. For example, one woman who they refer to as Linda has an experience of talking to her higher self, and her higher self comes to her and says, you do know that like you are love and like the universe is love, right? And she's like, well, I don't really think that's true. And then the higher self voice says, yeah, but like actually here's why it is true. And she keeps like pushing against it. And the higher self continues to respond and resolves all of the problems that she has with this view of seeing herself as worthy and meaningful. And I think that like an interaction with like a spirit of your higher self seems pretty mystical to me, and if we sort of incorporate more emphasis on the visionary mystical experience, for example, you could look at the Jewish philosophy related to prophecy, people interacting with angels. There's a huge tradition in Western occult work for interacting with your higher self. Within like Thelema and other traditions, there's the invocation to the Agatha Diamond, which is supposed to precisely be your higher self. So yeah, those 2 papers recently for me have been very interesting because they kind of provide me a lot of good content for making the arguments that I've been trying to make.
Oh, that's super cool. The occult stuff seems to be coming up on our show quite a bit because I feel like our psychedelic conversations in the Western tradition are a little ungrounded, and it seems like the non-ordinary state work that's been happening there for hundreds, if not of years, if not longer, seems to be a decent foundation for a lot of us Westerners, and more relatable than perhaps Chinese and Indian philosophy, perhaps.
Yeah, no, I very much agree. We're very much detached and dissociated from our own traditions here in the West. And a large part of the reason for that is like not only Catholicism, which largely tried to separate the general people from contact with the divine. It's only mediated by the priestly class. But then with the overturning of that worldview with the scientific revolution, and that in conjunction with Protestant reform, which very much sort of tried to do away with the imagination, as the imagination is, as some translations of Calvin say, is a factory for creating idols. And so, whether or not it's an image in the mind or an image in the church, these idols are considered to be the same. And as they were smashing the idols in the churches, they were also trying to smash the idols of the imagination. And we still very much live with the effect of that. And as a result, we're not very in touch with our imagination or with like the altered states of consciousness that are associated with those more imaginative experiences.
I'm sure somebody before Jung brought it back into the West, but I really appreciate Carl Jung's work with alchemy and trying to bridge the gap from practical alchemy into like philosophical, psychological speculations. And just wanted to say that I appreciate that. And I think do you know of others kind of before Jung that were trying to bring it into the psychological mainstream?
Yes, but they are occultists.
Right.
So you have like the Hermetic of the Golden Dawn, for example, in like the early 1900s. And they're like also kind of contemporary with Jung. There does seem to be a movement around like the early 20th century to sort of bring some of that stuff back. You also have a little bit earlier than that, what's his name? Eliphas Levi as well. Doing a lot of writing on like ritual ceremonial magic and trying to bring that back into consciousness. But as far as like science and that kind of thing, Jung, I think, is at least the person who made it be taken a little more seriously.
Yeah, I would tend to agree.
Was William James around before Jung? Or is that...
I think James is older than Jung.
Older.
A little bit.
Okay.
Yeah.
Not by too much, like maybe 50 years difference.
Yeah. I was wondering like how much of an influence he had. I mean, writing the variety of religious experiences, and he definitely explored like paranormal experiences and some of these.
I'm sure he had a big influence on
Yeah, for sure. And on just the study of religious experiences in general. I read the variety of religious experiences like too many years ago for me to be able to comment meaningfully on it. But I do know that there is in there a focus on the unitive experiences of like truth and union and that kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. So you're at what year in your career right now? Academic career?
I am I just finished my 4th year, but because I've been doing like a lot of community organizing work, I've got another year left.
Okay. Yeah. And why leave an academic environment like that if you don't have to? It sounds kind of perfect in a lot of ways.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
And I'm going to be here forever. So, I'm in no rush.
Cool. Yeah, I love Toronto. I really wish I could spend more time there. I go up, like I was saying earlier, to Waterloo for work quite a bit, but I think I need to, spend a couple extra days here and there in Toronto just to like get to know everybody. I haven't even met Bradley Foster yet. So I kind of owe it to myself to start meeting everybody up there, I think.
Yeah, I feel like everybody has met Bradley Foster. So you should definitely get on that.
Yeah. Kyle, you even met him, right?
Yeah, I hung out with him at Psychedelic Science. I'm surprised you didn't meet him because he gave us all those Psychedelic Today pins.
Yeah, I just wasn't there. We float around each other. We talk a lot, but yeah, just not in person.
Nice. Well, yeah, you should definitely take some time and visit here. The psychedelic scene is like just blossoming and it's fantastic. There's a picnic on Sunday that the Psychedelic Society is putting on.
Awesome.
Yeah, and a student that went through our Navigating Psychedelics course, he's an EMT, and he's doing some psychedelic first aid stuff for the Toronto Psychedelic Society. So that's really cool to see him move forward and share a lot of this information with that group too.
Mm-hmm.
Jake.
Yeah, they just started that last week.
Yeah, Jake Mitchell. Yeah. So yeah, I kind of want to come back to this idea of like mystical experiences. You said something about like engaging in the content, and then, with a background in neuroscience and whatnot, like how do you see this? Like, do you take a kind of scientific approach to this, or do you think like there is something transpersonal there to engage in? Like, how are you kind of viewing these mystical unitive experiences? Are you viewing it through a transpersonal lens, or is it more kind of like along a neuroscience, science lens?
A little bit of both. I will give you the neuroscience argument for now. But yeah, there's a lot of interesting philosophy and metaphysics to talk about here. So first, actually, I will mention that there is a study that's going to be published very soon. There was a presentation made at a conference about this research that was done by John DeBakey and his lab. He's running a lab called the Consciousness and Wisdom Studies Lab out of the University of Toronto. And they were studying the effects of mystical experiences on meaning in life. And they were just looking for mystical experiences in general, didn't have to be initiated by psychedelic experience. And what they found that was unexpected to the hypothesis they were working with, because John's work is very much on sort of the general processes involved in cognition. He refers to it as relevance realization. Like, the fundamental problem of the mind is how is it realizing relevance to us? Because there's just an infinite array of information in the universe. And what the most complicated task for brains to perform is selecting out information, selectively ignoring things so that we can highlight the most relevant information to act on. And what he actually found in this study was that the content can't actually be separated from the degree to which people find it meaningful. So within like the Hood mysticism scale, for example, you have the distinction made between the religious noetic qualities of the experience and then the interpretations that are applied to them afterwards. And the interpretations are kind of like the religious framework that you process the information through. Like, do you think it was sort of an experience of like the Christian God? Do you think it was an acquaintance with like the transcendent dharma of Buddhism, so on? But that content actually can't really be separated from how it's orienting a person meaningfully in their life. So that's important to note. There's a study coming out about that. And so when it comes to interacting with imagery and content within the experience, I think that why that's effective and indeed necessary is because of the effect that mental imagery has on the brain. So mental imagery is referred to as a form of top-down perception. There's a really good article by Pearson et al. 2015, where they're articulating the mechanisms of mental imagery and the possibilities for it to be used as a treatment. And so they show that it really does seem that mental imagery is just reverse perception, where perception kind of starts from the bottom up. There's like 5 primary areas involved in visual processing. V1 is just involved in like detecting basic line orientation, all the way up to like V4, which is involved in like color, motion perception. V5 as well is sort of involved in like integrating information into like whole objects and like the perception and recognition of objects. So as you're perceiving things, you have a flow of information coming from the world through your sense apparatus, and then up this hierarchy of visual perception, which is becoming more increasingly complex and organizing information into whole objects that you can act upon as it's traversing up this neural hierarchy. Now, the mental imagery works in the inverse way, where it begins at these higher visual processing areas and sends information down the hierarchy onto the lower areas. And so the more that the brain responds to mental imagery, the more that it looks like actually perceiving some object in the world, the more vivid people report their mental imagery is. And there's also studies that show that like the size of your early visual processing area, V1, that also relates to the clarity of mental imagery, such that if you have like a smaller V1, then I think it's that you report having less vivid mental imagery because there's not as much there to sort of project onto. Or actually, sorry, I might be getting that backwards. I will get back to you on that. But in any case, there is a tight relationship between perception and mental imagery. And what this means is that when you are making use of mental imagery, it's actually much more deeply embedded into your emotional processing, to your motivational processing than, say, linguistic rational reasoning. Linguistic reasoning is very useful, but it's actually very removed from how cognition works in general, right? And we share the faculty and the functions of imagination with like other animals. It's very much more basic to how organisms in general are processing information. And it's more holistic, you could say. It utilizes and recruits more areas of the brain, and it's having basically the same effect that perceiving things is having on the brain, such that you can get people in sports psychology, this is like a huge thing, getting people to sort of imagine doing well, imagine scoring goals, imagine practicing different skills involved in sports. And just imagining practicing something can have as much an effect on your performance of that thing as actually physically practicing the skill itself. So when it comes to how the brain is responding to information, especially if we're going to compare imagistic sorts of experiences that are making use of mental imagery and imagination to the unitive experience, which is fundamentally an experience of nothingness, it's very hard to act on nothing. So I think that not only is engaging with mental imagery going to be more effective and using more processing that's going to transform your motivation, your emotions, and so on, and the responses of your brain in daily life to the sorts of things that you're experiencing in the mental imagery context, you're also getting things that are much more useful. You're actually getting content that you can act on. You're getting insights that you can take into your life that you could integrate later on. And that is actually really important for making psychedelics useful, right? I think there's actually going to be a plateau where the unitive experiences are going to be very useful for a certain set of things. It's basically utilizing the machinery involved in insight. It's a giant aha moment. And that's useful for people who can't have those, right? If you are depressed, then your brain is sort of like much more rigid in its activity. It's not really going to be capable of performing insight as well as someone who's not depressed, because there's this network called the default mode network. We've all heard about this as a result of looking into psychedelic research, because psychedelics deactivate this network. It allows you to break out of that to reformulate how you're framing the world. And that's very useful for people who do not have that skill readily available to them, because that's basically like a neural skill. It's like a capacity to switch outside of a mode of framing and to reformulate how you're framing the world. But if we want to take psychedelics in sort of a developmental trajectory, we're going to start needing to use mental imagery and the actual content in the experience to sort of take useful things out of the mystical experiences that we're having and to make them articulate, to be able to talk about them. If we want to be able to have content we can refer to, it's useful to have content to interact with. And not just because it gives you information, but because it gives you stories that you can tell other people. You can kind of translate the perspectival shift that you have as a result of an imagistic experience by relating the sorts of stories and narratives that you have experienced within the context of that psychedelic experience. So I crossed a little bit from the neuroscience there to the strict psychological sort of phenomenological aspect, but there's a tight relationship between those things. And I hope that was clear. I kind of got into a flow state there, so you can tell me if I need to follow up on anything.
Yeah, no, that was good. Yeah, I don't know. This stuff is so fascinating. What would you say about like how to engage in that in some of those mental activities or mental imagery?
Yeah, so there's a practice called active imagination. This was introduced into therapeutic contexts by Carl Jung. And I think that practicing that is going to really enable you to make the most out of those imagistic experiences. It's basically what your brain is doing on psychedelics anyways, but it's also good to sort of get practice perceiving the landscape of mental imagery and learning how to interact with it. It's something that you kind of have to get a hand for. It can be helpful to have somebody else who's like maybe sitting for an experience with you to sort of guide you through the images. Yeah, it's hard to pinpoint very specific things on like how to best engage with imagery because it is going to be unique to everybody.
Right.
One of the things that I often recommend is just like looking into symbolic systems, reading into religious systems and getting that symbolic language, because once you internalize and memorize a symbolic language, it can be redeployed in the context of these imaginative experiences.
Yeah, it's interesting. Joe and I just kind of wrapped up talking about transpersonal psychology and these states of consciousness. And, you know, after having like a near-death experience and a lot of these psychedelic experiences, I got really like interested, I guess, in neuroscience and like trying to understand what's going on in the brain and how these experiences are like produced and really what's going on. And is this real? Like what, you know, just getting so caught up in that. And then I just got to a point where it's like, well, I don't care really how it's produced or if it's real. Like, has it had meaning in my life and has it influenced my life at all? And so it's interesting, you know, now that the more the neuroscience is coming out, it is really interesting to see how this stuff works. But I guess I always kind of come back to this like more transpersonal way of dealing with these states, of engaging it, you know, maybe through active imagination or something along those lines. I don't know. Do you think that like understanding it on the neuroscience and physiological level is important for understanding these states?
Yes, I do think there's use in doing that. And, I definitely agree with the sort of problem you're posing there, like in wondering, is it real and how's it happening? Well, what is more important is definitely, is it effective? And arguably, I think the imagination is one of the most effective means that we have for engaging within our own cognition and initiating transformations from within on ourselves. So where I think the neuroscience and that kind of stuff comes in usefully is that it's going to really allow us to develop programs for people to sort of figure where they're situated and what sorts of technologies of the mind they need to use and in what ways to maximize the capacities for human development.
Yeah, I always get stuck on like, what does that mean? So I think Ken Wilber is really helpful in those areas. Ken Wilber being kind of an integral theorist. I have some differences with him, but for the most part, he's really bright. His arguments around development lines being a good measure of how to look at what is human development, like what does that actually mean, potential improvement. Mm-hmm. I think that framework of development lines and stages in their development lines is really helpful. Like, cooking, interpersonal relationships, playing music, enjoying music, all those things I think could be like individual development lines. And there's so many of them. I guess the main trick there is to figure out what ones you might be pathologically deficient in and figure out how to work on those. And then you can work on it more holistically, I guess, to raise the bar on the other ones. But that's how I conceptualize it, at least. Hopefully I'm not too far off base. But I think that's a good way.
Yeah, that's definitely great, because you don't want to just be focusing on like the transcendent transpersonal domain where you're just interacting with entities and trying to channel divine truth from something from this star constellation of Sirius, right? If you don't know how to cook and you can't take care of yourself, that's not going to be very helpful.
No.
Amen. Yeah. What good does it talk to your true self if you just can barely get through a day?
Right.
Yeah. You're not really expressing that true self as fully as possible. I have a background in Thelema, by the way, so I kind of related to what you were saying earlier. And that's another way I kind of contextualize a lot of this stuff is like, to what degree are you expressing the ultimate expression of you and what's really you, not your, Rolex wearing,
right,
Bentley driving self. Different,
yes.
Higher order thing.
Very different. And yeah, what you're getting at there too is important, that there is sort of like an objective notion of like what is the best you, right? And it doesn't just have to be this egoic notion that you develop of some like divine power. Yeah, you've got to very much keep it grounded and be able to sort of bring the insights that you have back into the community to be an effective member of society, right? You can't just differentiate off into your own space of intellectual interests and not really be able to sort of communicate. Like interpersonal relationships is especially like a very important development line, I think.
So one of the best things that the current U.S. President Donald Trump is giving us is an insight into like what does the opposite of what we're shooting for look like. Like it does not it does not look like that. It totally underdeveloped, crude, can barely negotiate, public speaking,
right,
insulting to everybody, all the time.
Right.
I just heard that he criticized one of the older George Bush for being a widow and made some other really crude jokes on a single rally. Like, dude, you got to pump the brakes. So, this is an example of what bad behavior looks like, and we can learn from that. Maybe it's just, that's one of our lessons is like, look, we got this thing here. It sucks a lot. Hopefully we can all learn from it and better ourselves and our communities as a result.
Mm-hmm, yes, it is good to have role models as to what not to do, as much as it is role models for what to do.
Yeah. I try not to bring him up too much. Go ahead, Kyle.
Yeah. I was just thinking back to maybe like the mechanism of healing within, like, say, psychedelics, to kind of, I guess, bring the conversation back that way, is like, do you think what's happening on the physiological level within the mind is a therapeutic part of the psychedelic, or do you think it is more the imaginative aspects of psychedelics? Is that where the therapeutic or personal development aspects of that comes into play?
So I think it's going to be different for everybody. I mentioned the example of like depression, and for people who are experiencing depression, it's very useful just to get those like chemical, physiological systems tuned up, because they're kind of rigid and not really working in the person's favor. But then for many other people, what psychedelics do is they unlock the imagination, they unleash the imagination, and it's the imagination that's initiating the transformations. And you could use the term transcendent function. It's another of Carl Jung's terms, which I like a lot. And according to Dan Merker, he's got a great book called Gnosis about active imagination and how the Gnostics may have been using something like active imagination to generate revelations that they consider to be from Christ, where Christ is actually this like sort of universal function. You could kind of relate it to the notion of the active intellect in Aristotle's philosophy, where it's sort of the thing that brings latent potential into being. But for the Christ function specifically, it's what brings into being the best of all possible worlds, to put it in very simple terms. And so what Merker considers to be the case in Gnosticism is that Christ is basically this notion of the transcendent function. And the transcendent function can be activated by any number of different kinds of imagery. It's kind of different for every person. He gives the example of this one gospel, which I can't remember the name of, but the idea is that two of Jesus's disciples see Jesus on the shore. They're like fishing or something, and he appears to each of them in a different way. To one of them, he appears as this very young, youthful man. And to the other one, he appears as this sort of like more old, wizened figure. And they both agree that this is indeed the same individual. But what was needed to translate the same insight to each of them is unique to their own psyche and the relationships that are at play within their own psyche. And so that's where I think like the imagination and the content is really going to come into play for a lot of people, is that in order to have certain insights, it's not enough just to sort of have the insight machinery triggered by the neurophysiological stuff happening as a result of psychedelics, but it also needs to be presented to you in a way that makes it intelligible. Yeah. And so again, to refer back to like where the neuroscience is useful is sort of being able to pinpoint and diagnose what's useful for who at what time.
Yeah, that's interesting. It kind of almost makes me think back to like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, like, maybe somebody with like depression, maybe their like neural pathways aren't like so open, and maybe getting like a small dose of like psilocybin or something like that can start opening that process. It's starting to activate some of those serotonin receptors, get somebody back in line, and then maybe like higher doses can then you might be more ready to engage in some of that more active type of imagination process. Yeah, I don't know. It's interesting because some of the neuroscience is super cool about like the default mode network and how psychedelics like promote neurogenesis and new brain growth, and they're opening up these new neural pathways. I mean, that is so crucial for people with depression and different mental health issues. But yeah, maybe getting that back to some sort of baseline is important first. And then maybe engaging more into the mystical could be, important once you're kind of back to baseline and somewhat functioning.
Yes, totally. And to refer back to that notion of like developmental lines, like the developmental line that I think we should all be orienting ourselves toward is wisdom, right? And there's a growing body of research into wisdom in psychology and in neuroscience, more in psychology. But I think that that's really going to be where a lot of the interesting work is going to be done in psychedelics once we get a lot of data and information about how they're effective for mental health. The question that follows that is, how are they useful for people who just want to develop more in general, right? Once you have your life stable, once everything is sort of taken care of, your relationships are taken care of, your job is taken care of, and so on. Like, where do we move beyond that? What are the possibilities for human development, right? And wisdom is an ideal that human culture has always been oriented towards, but something that we're really not doing a good job of imparting to people within our particular society. And if you look at shamanism, if you look at where psychedelics have played a role in like Greek culture and all throughout the world, it's precisely the wisest people who are the ones utilizing these things and who are giving them to other people. So there's a very strong relationship between wisdom and psychedelics. And that is where I think there's just immense amounts of interesting work to be done.
Mm.
So you're familiar with researchers that are doing that right now?
Yeah, definitely. There's a guy named Igor Grossman who's got this construct called wise reasoning. I really want to apply some tests to psychedelics in relation to this wise reasoning construct, because I think that psychedelics just basically give you everything that he says is related to wise reasoning. So you have like a focus on bigger picture thinking, greater emotional complexity, meaning there's lots of different emotions experienced within the context of reasoning about something problematic that's occurred to you. However, a greater disposition towards positive emotions versus negative emotions. And he also shows that social contexts can facilitate reasoning according to his notions of wisdom, more so than just reasoning on your own, which I think has interesting implications for mental imagery related experiences, visionary experiences, because a lot of the times, like, there are other imagined entities and beings that are sort of talking to you and interacting with you. So you can use your imagination to kind of simulate the social contexts that are implicated in wise reasoning.
I like that a lot. I had no idea that was. I feel a little ashamed for not knowing that was something that people were doing work on.
Well, it's been a thing since the 80s. Like Paul Baltz, he's a researcher, I think, from Germany, and he kind of started looking into wisdom as a psychological construct. There's also a researcher named Monica Ardelt who does some good stuff. There's a guy at the University of Toronto named Michel Ferrari. He's got a bunch of good publications on this.
Wow. Okay. That's great. And nobody's really bridged psychedelics into this yet, as far as you know?
Yeah. It's very nascent. There's glimmerings within the research that's a useful way to go, but really no one's made that explicit yet.
Got it.
I think cool. Like our breathwork teacher Lenny, like when he talked to Stan Groff about like all this new research emerging, like one of Groff's like thing was like, well, it's all been done before. He's like, I think the real potential is in creativity and, you know, kind of like this exploration of wisdom and insight and whatnot.
That's probably why Lenny always focuses on philosophy as core.
Yeah.
Like we need to be engaged in philosophy at the same time we're engaged in psychedelics, so that we can hopefully become more skilled humans and better able to negotiate those things.
That sounds
wisely.
Exactly correct.
Right. Cool. So we're actually going to be doing some interesting stuff with that. I think kind of breathwork meets philosophy seminars. So like, I think not necessarily seminars, but more interactive. So like actually doing philosophy as opposed to being talked at about the history of philosophy, right. You know?
Amazing.
Yeah. How do we make it a living, breathing thing again? So our teacher, Lenny, is going to be working with us in the near future to help make that more a thing that we do and help people do.
Wonderful. Is that going to be like a platform you're running through the website?
It's going to be more in person. For sure.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm sure there could be some online stuff, but yeah, I think it'll be part of the breathwork training that's coming soon.
Right. That makes sense. Yeah, that would be great to pair those together. Do you know where you're going to roll that out first, or are you still kind of
U.S. Northeast probably?
Yeah. Okay.
But TBD.
Yeah.
We're in the beginning phases of mapping all this stuff out. So
yeah. So you'll
hopefully
listeners
in the
will
next
be hearing
year.
More. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Next year. Within the next
cool.
year.
Awesome. I look forward to hearing about that. That sounds exactly like the work that needs to be done.
We'll keep you in the loop for sure.
Excellent.
All right. So next one, what do we have?
Yeah. So there's some other things that I can think of that are interesting to talk about related to this wisdom stuff that we're talking about. But if you have other questions, you're more than welcome to change the course of the conversation.
Yeah, let's go for it.
Okay, cool. So another thing that I think that there's a lot of space to look at in psychedelics is the relationship between rationality and psychedelics, because you mentioned specifically creativity being a large focus for psychedelics. And that is especially true in, I think, the phenomena of microdosing. And I think it's very evident that psychedelics do make you more creative, but do they make you more rational? That is an interesting question. So there's a guy named Keith Stanovich. He's got a great book called What Intelligence Tests Miss. And he draws the distinction between intelligence and rationality, where intelligence is just like the basic computational capacity of your neurons to be able to perform things. But rationality are basically, they're like different attentional modes for you to process information. So mindfulness, for example, can be seen as a form of rationality that makes you open to information and not sort of pre-attentively filtering things out that might be relevant for you to consider. Because your capacity to reason about things is largely determined by what you allow into the space of reasons within your conscious mind, right? And there's a lot of sort of pre-attentive filtering out of information that you're doing. So cultivating different cognitive styles, such as active open-mindedness, and, for example, being open to considering other sorts of views, which is related to the cognitive bias. It's like the inverse of the cognitive bias of dogmatism. Those will greatly change your capacity to be a more rational agent, a more rational actor in the world. And so he has this model called the triune mind, which is split up between sort of the algorithmic, the first level is the computational mind, then there's the algorithmic mind, and then there's the reflective mind. And then those are all sort of related to like the speed of processing at which your mind works. The computational mind is, like I said, just your basic capacity for your neurons to like do certain things. The algorithmic mind is these sort of learned processes that you sort of pass information through. It's kind of like your first pass at processing things. If you're related to dual systems theories in psychology, the algorithmic mind is sort of your system one. It's your hot and fast processing that governs your immediate reactions to things. And then you have your reflective mind, which is more characteristic of the what's called system two in the dual process theories, which is usually also called the sort of cold system, because it's a little bit slower. It's more deliberate. It's the thing that you actually have cognitive control over. And you have to be able to learn how to have these levels of the mind interact, which is actually very difficult to do. The majority of processing in our daily lives is, in fact, automatic, because, regardless of whether or not you want to exist, you do exist, you have a brain, and your brain's going to do things regardless of whether or not you kind of take control of the wheels or not. And so what psychedelics do, especially in like dissolving the default mode network and dissolving these other networks that develop over the course of your life, it's basically resetting the neural system and allowing you to learn different ways of processing and filtering information and to change those algorithms that your brain has kind of internalized as these automatic neural behaviors. For example, in trauma, you have an automatic reaction between like the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. When there's something that seems threatening comes into your awareness, there's an automatic, very early response within that neural subsystem that diverts attention and suppresses the information. And that's happening so quickly and so automatically that you can't really intervene with it. But it's a maladaptive process that's interfering with your capacity to live a fulfilled life, And so it's these early algorithmic processes that psychedelics can really help alleviate us from, such that they can increase the interaction between the reflective and algorithmic minds to sort of bring us into a state of mind where we're less determined by these pre-conscious algorithms and can thereby actually be used to facilitate rational thinking, according to how Stanovich defines it.
Yeah, this is fascinating. It makes me wonder too about like rational thinking, like that study that came out about lifetime experience with classical psychedelics predict pro-environmental behavior changes during, So like thinking like, people that have been taking this stuff, they're thinking a little bit more about the environment, maybe thinking about like a little bit more rationally. It's like, oh wait, this is not infinite, all these resources. Let's be a little bit more cautious.
Right. Yeah, you could definitely draw some relationships there. And there's also like the reduced authoritarianism thing, which is also interesting because, authoritarianism, and that's like a whole subject on its own, but definitely seems to be related to people's fear. And so it's a very sort of like automatic fear-based sort of response where we're trying to initiate these really artificial and they're like systems of control that are artificial and like too strong to sort of like be effective in the real world. And as a result, they cause lots of suffering and are not very rational as a result. One of the measures that Stanovich uses for rationality is he has like both intellectual rationality and pragmatic rationality. And so intellectual rationality is your capacity and ability to update your beliefs in light of evidence that goes against your beliefs. And then pragmatic rationality is basically like utilitarianism, like how good for you or the community are the decisions that you're making. And a very strong sense of authoritarianism usually is not very good for a community in general. It might be very good for a very small group of people, right? But it's not the utilitarian way to go often. So I think, you could also sort of like look at that in the frame of rationality and the reduction of authoritarianism as more of an openness to considering other perspectives and not needing to have to feel safe by implementing these very strong systems of control.
Yeah, that's wild. Yeah, you're really opening up a lot of conversations that I think we've been maybe on the cusp of, but we've not really gone this far. So this is really awesome, and I appreciate this.
Cool. I'm having a great time, so I'm glad you are as well.
Good.
Well, what about the opposite too of like rational thinking and psychedelics? Like, do you think it can also promote like, not rational thinking?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And this is one of the dark sides of especially like the unitive experience, which is why I think that we need to be nesting the unitive experience within the visionary experience, because part of the unitive experience is a sense of being acquainted with absolute truth, but also there's not really any content. So you feel that you really know what's true, but you can't really articulate very well what's true, right? And so that can make you very irrational, because you can kind of just consider whatever you already thought to be true to be really true, just because it kind of feels that way, right? It just initiates the sensation of truth within your brain. And unless that's constrained and coordinated by some philosophical system, some spiritual system, some system of like community, some standards of rationality, you can very, very easily miscoordinate your mind from reality completely by using psychedelics too much and not in the right contexts. So there's a huge dark side to be talked about and articulated there.
Yeah, it makes me think about like rationality, and maybe like the deconstruction can cause a lot of irrational thoughts and thinking, but like that integration time to really sit and reflect on a lot of those things is maybe really important for more rational thoughts. Because I mean, I've definitely been in those situations where, you have like a unitive or mystical experience and like everything is just bliss and love. And, I'm going to just like have these thoughts of quitting everything and doing this and doing that. And, sounds really rational at the time. And who knows, maybe it is. Maybe if I did follow that, maybe it could have turned into something else. But, being able to like really sit and integrate some of that stuff and reflect on it for some time. Yeah, I don't know. I definitely have friends that have just like acted on impulse with some of those insights. And it's like, whoa, like maybe sitting with that would have been a little bit healthier, or
Yeah.
I don't really know. It's hard to judge somebody's experience.
For sure, yeah. Sometimes it is the right decision to just like jump on those things and make changes. But yeah, usually like processing and waiting for that feeling of motivation to subside a little bit to see if you actually sort of resonate with those insights is definitely a good way to go. And so, for example, there was somebody that I met at Beyond Psychedelics. I'm going to probably butcher her last name, but I'm going to try. Her name is Marta Kasamarzik. I hope that is correct. But so she's also doing work in cognitive science. She was giving a presentation on entity contact. And she talked about this cycle that builds up when people perceive entities in the context of the psychedelic experience. These entities give them some kind of information. Unless they have like well-grounded philosophy for understanding what that experience is, very often they'll just become motivated to just like start doing more psychedelics all of the time. They feel that they have been chosen, they are special, and that they need to contact these independently existing beings from the stars to find some divine truth that will like save the planet or something like this. And what usually happens is that these people become completely incapable of like being talked down, and they require a complete psychotic break to get them out of this cycle, like having hallucinations occur just in general life in the waking world. And nothing else can really sort of get at and into them. So yeah, sometimes the insights that you have, and especially how you're having them, unless they're kind of appropriately constrained within a framework, they can be very damaging. Yeah. And actually, one of the things she mentioned too was that those kinds of experiences, and like when that sort of cycle builds up, are also related to extreme depersonalization persisting after the state. So the person still kind of feels detached from reality. And what she recommended was that facilitators in psychedelic experiences need to be versed in grounding techniques and to not confuse depersonalization for enlightenment. And a lot of the frameworks that we have, I think sometimes, especially the frameworks that are coming from Buddhism, when taken into a Western context, are really just referring to like nihilistic depersonalization experiences that like are just not good for people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, like after, my early exposure to a lot of this stuff, after like having, this near-death experience and psychedelic experiences, like, I really started reading a lot of Buddhist texts to try to wrap my mind around illusions and, unity consciousness, and realizing that like I was just too far out there. And that's like when I came more into transpersonal and shamanism, where it was like, for me, like the shamanistic stuff was just rooted in nature, and it was just more grounding. It was like, that's what I needed. Like I was so out of my body and so depersonalized that like I needed to learn how to like interact with like nature and be a little bit more rooted in this world.
Excellent. Yeah, I'm glad that you came across that, because I similarly had experiences like that. And it was really like the sort of like occult magic and like Jewish philosophy that kind of brought me back into the world. So now that we don't have the videos, I wasn't able to tell. Was that, Joe, was that you that was speaking?
That was Kyle right there.
That was Kyle. Okay. Because I was wondering, Joe, you mentioned Thelema. Like, did you find that had any effect and shift in how you were understanding the psychedelic experience along those kinds of lines?
Yes. It kind of like devalued a little bit the Buddhist orientation, Buddhist Hindu orientation I was carrying into the world, and it kind of reframed the purpose of living in life. Like to me, it's a really life affirming philosophy, whereas Buddhism doesn't seem so life affirming to me. It seems kind of like negative, like all is suffering, as opposed to the inverse is all is bliss. Like, how can we really embody life and really do life well? So I think, Tim Leary was a big fan of Crowley. So like it was, it's like a big kind of soup that we're all trying to swim through and negotiate. And yeah, I found that it really did help. It like really helped reframe and put things in a positive direction for me, as opposed to like, let me kill myself and well, metaphorically kill myself and do less and less and less and become less and less and less.
Yes.
Very inverse things.
Yeah. One thing that I've noticed is that like the almighty self is like the ultimate psychotechnology of the West, and there's a place for that. It's got to be appropriately situated. But I think that like having a self, having a being an actor in the world, it's like, that's what you are, Don't try to annihilate yourself so that nature can flow through you. It was already doing that before you came in. Why don't you just try to elevate how nature is flowing through you such that we pull the world into something more bliss-oriented?
I
like that.
Yeah, that's kind of why I like this whole, there's this kind of push in the Burning Man world to like, first off, like keep surviving on the planet. And then secondarily, how do we make the planet feel like a festival all the time? Like, how do we make it like, we're doing art, being good to each other and having a great time while being sustainable. Like, I think there's something there, is the essence of this thing art, and what does art look like for that thing? Yeah. Art as living, conversation can be an art form. Being nice to each other, gifting, all that kind of stuff. There's something interesting there. I don't know exactly what, but I like that concept of like festival planet. Like, how do we kind of break down these kind of wacky walls that we've imprisoned ourselves in?
Yeah, that sounds like exactly the planet that I want to live on. So,
yeah, live with slightly less fiction than we live with now, and have a better time.
Yes, and hopefully less suffering someday.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's inevitable, but I think we can do a better job of making life a better place.
Yeah, like giving people skills to deal with suffering, as opposed to like, how do we negotiate suffering better, as opposed to just dealing with it or thinking all existence is suffering and blah, blah, blah. People, that's kind of an oversimplification of Buddhism for a lot of people. But to me, there's a lot of value in Buddhism, but it's just kind of, why do we want to live that way at this point when life can be so fun?
For sure. Yeah, and I think like the Tantra stuff is like where it becomes really powerful and really useful. And actually, I think, a better interpretation, or at least one that I take on like the first noble truth that life is suffering, it's actually more so that without intervention, life will tend towards suffering.
That seems more skillful. Yeah.
Yeah. It's less, nihilistic. There's like an imperative on agency there for sure. And I think that imperative on agency is like very much within Buddhism. And, I think trying to bring it into the Western context as we have like over the past, 100 years or so, there's actually a really interesting effect of Christian mysticism that has been had on our interpretations of Buddhism. Because if you look at things like Meister Eckhart, I'm pretty sure that's the person I'm thinking of, but there's like, within like the Renaissance and earlier, a lot of the Christian mystics were oriented towards annihilating the self. Like the self was basically an intervention and impairment in God. And you had to just vacate yourself so that God could flow through you. And if you weren't doing that, then you were basically interfering in the flow of God into the world. So those interpretations that we have of Buddhism as being very nihilistic, I think actually are a holdover from this Christian specter that's living within our minds that we're not really fully aware of.
It's interesting, like when I think of like all life is suffering, that like I guess it has a negative connotation, but for me it's like, well, if all life is suffering, we should enjoy it a little bit more. For me, it kind of elicits more of a positive thing of like, yeah, this is what it is. So let's just enjoy it while we're here. It's a beautiful thing. Right. But knowing that suffering is part of all of this. And, you could still try to enjoy it, even though there's suffering.
Yeah. There is like that interpretation is very liberating for sure.
Yeah.
And I'm checking the time. So we're at like an hour and 5 minutes. I mean, I could talk about this all day, but is it beyond our
let's kind of slow her down. So you've been involved in this field for a bit now, and you're doing a lot of organizing. So doubtless you're getting approached by students and people asking you how they can get involved. Do you typically have any advice for people?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I usually mention is just like follow your heart and do not feel the need to disguise what you want to do. As I mentioned earlier, there's really not a lot of negative pushback that you're going to get from being interested in psychedelic research. And the best thing that you can do is to be enthusiastic and to also be correct about things. So study hard, and if you want to study psychedelics, specifically do that. There's plenty of areas to be doing that nowadays. And as we come into be doing more research, we're going to need more neuroscientists, more chemists. And I think we're especially going to need like philosophers for kind of like fleshing out how to integrate psychedelics into our society. So there's literally just a million possibilities for getting involved academically. And that's usually the sort of advice that people ask me for is like, academic advice, and usually I'll just mention that. It's like, there's really no barriers. I mean, there are, but they're not so significant that we can't overcome them, right? There's plenty of careers that are going to be available in the next 20, 30 years within the field of psychedelic research and psychedelic treatment. So I think that right now we're really well situated to just sort of start studying, doing what we want, and helping to carve the way forward in these kinds of research. Trying to think of like other practical things. Yeah,
any other tips for like community organizing or events or anything like that?
Yeah, one thing that I focus on personally is trying to emphasize academic rigor. Because sometimes that gets left to the wayside when it comes to psychedelics. People are very excited, and sometimes people who are very excited don't always really have the most true things to say, to put it bluntly. And so, for example, after my presentation at Beyond Psychedelics, there was this person who was talking about using this giant fMRI machine to take images of the brains of shamans and interpret their visual cortex so that we could get objective pictures of different dimensions, because the shamans are going to different dimensions and their brains are responding in results to these perceptions in different dimensions. And so therefore we can take pictures of different dimensions using fMRI. And I mean, that is just not true. And you're never going to get that by a neuroscience research board, because all they're going to say is that, but we already know that imagination and perception function on the same machinery. So all that you're showing me is that this person imagines this thing. And I think we all owe it to the world to try to be as serious and rigorous about psychedelics as we can, because it was precisely this lack of rigor and this overexcitement that got us into trouble with Timothy Leary and others back in the 60s and 70s. So yeah, when it comes to organizing, that's something that I always focus on, vetting the people who are presenting, and yeah, keeping in mind that we want to be creating a good impression on the public, and we still need to be doing that consistently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great advice. Thanks for that.
And how do people find you online?
That is a good question. So I have a YouTube channel currently that I'm uploading this psychedelic class that I just did. So you can just find me with my name, Daniel Greig. I can send you a link if you want to put that up in the notes of this podcast. I also have a blog that's not very well maintained, but I'm going to be launching a website probably sometime in September. So I'll probably hold off until getting that information out there when that's been reworked.
Great. So Dan, thank you for joining us on the show. Really appreciated it. And I think we should have you on in the future. It'd be really fun to connect again soon.
Awesome. I would love to. I feel like, yes, we have lots of things that were left untalked about, and I would love to pick your brains and have you pick my brains about it. I had a wonderful time with this conversation.
All right. Take care.
See you later.
Thanks for tuning in, everybody. Hope you enjoyed that interview with Daniel Greig. And yeah, keep sharing the good word out there, everybody. There's a lot of positive stuff we can do here with psychedelics, as you can clearly see from that interview. And there's a lot of harm to be reduced. Right now, we're in the middle of festival season. It's July 10 as I record this. And there's probably 10 festivals easy going on right now that we could be doing harm reduction services at. And people out there are exposed to risks from contaminated drugs, fentanyl, and various things, or being sold things that they are being misrepresented. Buy a test kit. Go over to Dance Safe and check that out. If you want to just get educated and understand how to operate in those spaces, check us out, Navigating Psychedelics. You can find it from psychedelicstoday.com. So thank you, everybody, for tuning in. And yeah, be sure to just tell your friends about us and just keep staying in touch. Peace.